Well, folks, after some eye-watering increases to the cost of adding new rooms to our player houses in last week's alpha suggested that perhaps the 12.2.7 housing preview might end up disappointing at least some housing enthusiasts, there was much better news in this week's new midnight alpha. I'll be taking a look at those changes and how they'll likely affect the 12.2.7 preview later in this video, but first, let's get some updates on the live game. Today, as this video goes live, is November the 1st, and I know it's hard to believe the year is almost over, at least until you see all the holiday displays in the shops, but it really is, and that means a brand new trading post. If you haven't already had a chance to check it out, this month's post has a distinctly Thanksgiving feel to it, with a bunch of cooking and dining themed weapon transmogs, and not one but 2 turkey mounts. The Highland Gobbler costs just 500 traders tender, and the monthly reward for filling out the Traveller's Log bar is the prized turkey. This does mean that it's a fairly cheap month for mount collectors, so you may actually get a chance to pick up some of those weapon appearances, which could end up being useful in Midnight, where we will be able to have a separate transmog set when our characters are in their homes. Next up is something for the avid mount collector, the mysterious Zeiss Cartel Gear Glider, whose source was listed as redacted in the Mount Journal, has been discovered by, of course, the WoW secret finding Discord. Obtaining the mount will require getting to Renown 8 with Manifold Vandals, the Manifold Omega Raid Renown, and you will also need to run at least part of the raid for 3 weeks on any difficulty. The first step, as I think quite a few of us originally speculated, involves the new 11.2.0 Inscription Cartel deals. There are 3 deals that scribes can create, and which are also available in the auction house for cartels Ba, Om and Zo. Using one of these deals makes you a member of that cartel for the week, and you can only join one cartel each week, although there is a bug that has allowed some players to manage to join all 3 in the same week. Each of the cartels has hidden a lootable cache inside the raid, which you can loot for a grey item and progress towards the mount. The first, for Cartel Ba, is located just after Plexus Sentinel. Just go right instead of going left, and it is lying just to the left of the portal, and this one can be done in Wing 1 of LFR. The second, for Cartel Zo, is located on the way to Forge Weaver Araz. Once you kill the mini-boss on the right-hand path, where you would normally use your cloak to hopefully avoid getting hit by that death beam, there is a pipe that you can jump onto and run along to find the cache. Now, there is a kind of bracket partway along the pipe that you do have to try and sidle past, and I personally recommend doing this at RP walk speed if you find these particular mechanic a bit hard to do. And the third is just after Fractalus. Just head over to the building, and instead of going inside, run round the back to find it lying on a rock here. Both of those last 2 can be done in Wing 2 of LFR. One thing to be aware of is that the first 2 of those caches are only available before you defeat Araz. Once that boss is defeatable, they become completely inaccessible on that lockout until the weekly reset. Once you've looted all 3 of the caches, just head outside the entrance to the raid, and one of the NPCs who hang out just to the left of the entrance, Zoturo, will have a brand new quest for you, which will award the mount, along with a cool ethereal Transmorpher toy. And one last tip: you don't need to worry about hanging on to the grey items that you loot from the cache. The quest is still available even if you vendor or destroy these. Moving over to Remix, and this week has seen a bunch of buffs to some of the artifact tree options. This is likely a further attempt by the developers to try and wean us off that fell row, which, as you might expect, didn't get any of the buffs. Given that most people in Remix are at the point where they're completely overpowering most content, I personally suspect that we're probably so used to using that fell row that this buff won't have much effect. But they are still very good news for the infinite research quests, which require us to use different rows. The other change to Remix this week is one that is a bit less welcome, but also hopefully temporary, and that is that the option to transfer a Remix character to the live game has been removed. This is very likely due to an exploit that saw some players being able to bring remix keystones and their power into retail. Blizzard haven't spoken publicly about this, so we don't know when or even if they will bring back the ability to transfer characters to the live game, but hopefully they do, and it will be soon. But in the meantime, I personally recommend working on the assumption that your characters might end up being trapped in remix until the event ends in the week of January the 19th. And finally, for remix is a quick reminder that next week we'll see the launch of Phase 3. This will open up access to the Broken Shore, the Cathedral of Eternal Night, and the Tomb of Sargeras raid, along with a few more cosmetic options, the most eye-catching of which are the recolours of Teshulash, which will require doing the raid. For mount collectors, there aren't any new remix exclusive mounts this week, but for people who missed the Paragon reward mounts, they will be unlocked, along with the Abyss Worm, which originally dropped from Mistress Cecine in the raid. And just before I move over to looking at all the news from the PTR and Alpha, something that has been getting a bit of attention in the WoW community this week was a leak by Windows Central, who reported that the next generation Microsoft Xbox console will be able to run World of Warcraft, along with pretty much every other Windows game, and even things like Microsoft Word and Excel. Now, there was a widespread initial reaction that this meant that WoW was being ported to consoles, and that is the real reason behind Blizzard's add-on Apocalypse. But I suspect that many of you are already aware that that's really not the case. World of Warcraft is already able to run on some consoles, including the Steam Deck and the new Windows-based handhelds like the Asus ROG Ally. And the new Xbox is basically just a fully featured PC with a very thin console skin that can be peeled back to allow access to the underlying Windows operating system, allowing you to run any Windows application, including of course Battle.net and World of Warcraft. And there will be absolutely no need to use a controller, as this new Xbox will, I am sure, support a keyboard and a mouse. Even if it is true that Blizzard does want to make World of Warcraft a bit more console friendly for this new Xbox's release, as that release is unlikely to happen until 2027 or more likely 2028, it really doesn't explain why the dev team is rushing to restrict add-ons right at the start of midnight. In reality, I think that this push to restrict add-ons is a lot more about trying to make the game more accessible and appealing to new players, no matter what platform they choose to use. Anyways, heading over to the PTR, and we've now had a chance to check out the new Brawlers Guild season. This new season sadly does not seem to have a new questline, something that was a very successful feature of the Battle for Azeroth version of the Brawlers Guild. Instead, we're only getting 4 new bosses to join the previous lineup. At rank 1, we get Sunny, the brand new first boss of the guild. Rank 2 has the Quacken, a tentacly void corrupted duck boss who will polymorph you into a duck and force you to try to outrun his tentacles. Rank 4 gives us Glorp, a mutated abomination where you need to manage the pulls he drops to avoid getting stunned or even empowering him. And at rank 7, the Renegade Swabby, a Plunderstorm themed boss with some fairly interesting mechanics. Defeating the Swabby will grant you a brand new title, First Mate Rate. As with previous Brawlers Guild, defeating bosses in the Brawlers Guild will grant you Brawlers Gold, which you can spend on rewards, which will include a new Crocolisk mount, Brawlin' Bruno, which requires reaching rank 6, and the Ballistic Bronco rocket mount, which requires rank 8. And as you might expect for the very first housing patch, there's also going to be some housing related rewards, including at rank 2, the Brawler's Barricade, at rank 6, the Brawlers Guild Punching Bag, and I do wonder if this will act as a target dummy, and at rank 9, the Champion Brawlers Gloves, a really cool looking wall trophy. You will also be able to collect some of the older rewards, though sadly not the mounts. The most interesting of those older rewards is the Pugilist Punching Ring, which offers you a teleport to the Brawlers Guild on a 60-minute cooldown. This is notable as it acts as a teleport to your faction capitals of Stormwind or Orgrimmar, and it does work even when the guild is not open. We don't currently know if this version of the Brawlers Guild is going to be time limited or not. In the past, the Brawlers Guild was removed at the end of an expansion, but in interviews, the developers had previously said that they wanted a new version to be evergreen. So hopefully it will end up sticking around this time. I will be doing a more in-depth guide to the Brawlers Guild once the new patch is live, so do subscribe if you don't want to miss out on that. The much more interesting news though has been some major changes to the housing limits, which were announced on the Midnight Alpha, but which I am now being able to confirm will also apply to 12.2.7's early access. During the PTR open access testing, I think that a lot of us were surprised by how quickly we would hit the initial housing decor limit of 300. The reason for this is that the housing items have a cost, and for decor, they can cost anything from 1 through to 5. In my initial testing, I personally found that in practice, that 300 limit would translate to a real-world limit of around 80 to 90 items, which when we had 9 rooms to play with in the initial test, really didn't go very far. Realistically, I was only able to produce a satisfying decoration layout for 3 of the rooms, but that was using a fairly minimalist approach, and overall it did feel like the interior decor limits and the room limits were not very well balanced. Following that initial test on the Midnight Alpha, Blizzard announced that they were adding placement costs for rooms as well. At the time, housing was temporarily disabled, so this change ended up going a little bit under the radar. Mego and their community managed to data mine the costs, and they were, well, eye-watering expensive. So much so that many of the larger room sizes were costing more than your entire day one housing budget. Now, it is worth saying that housing rooms are a lot bigger than their small, medium and large naming does imply. In practice, even the small rooms are pretty roomy, and the large room is more like a concert hall than a room, and many of the creators who did use that biggest room ended up subdividing it into smaller areas. Nevertheless, this would have probably have meant that we'd have ended up being limited to just 1 or 2 rooms in practice, at least until we were able to unlock higher limits. Thankfully though, these room budgets have turned out to be a bit of a work in progress, and this week Blizzard have announced some very substantial increases to the housing budgets for both decor and rooms. And these changes are, I think, going to be a bit of a game changer, with the initial room limit rising from 9 to 19, likely meaning we'll be able to start out with 4 to 5 rooms, and decor rising from 300 to 910, which I think will translate to around 250 to 300 items placed in practice. Currently, player housing has 5 ranks in total to unlock, but I suspect that these 5 ranks are only for the early access, with a lot more ranks to open up probably over time during midnight. And reaching rank 5 will raise those limits to 43 for rooms and 2050 for decor. Or in other words, you'll end up being able to fit out around 10 to 12 rooms and 600 to 700 decor items. I do think that these new limits will do a much better job of balancing the number of rooms with the amount of decoration items, and will enable us to have a lot more elaborate setups. And it is, I am sure, going to take a lot more effort to start to hit those limits. So overall, this is a very positive update. That said, I'm not personally a fan of the developers' current approach to costs, which I think are still far too high and will create a mismatch between the expectations of players who are less familiar with the system and the reality. My own personal feedback to the developers is that it would be much better to reduce the placement costs quite a bit and instead have much lower limits as well, as this would greatly reduce the gap between player expectation and reality. Just before we move on to the news from the alpha proper, we now have an official date for the launch of the Midnight Beta, which will be on November the 11th. As well as continuing the usual weekly waves of invites to the test realm, players who bought the Epic Edition of Midnight will be getting guaranteed access to the beta, meaning that for many players, this will be the first chance to drop in and take a look at not just housing, but the rest of the main expansion content. This announcement was accompanied with a graphic covering the week 1 content that will be available, which is predominantly leveling in max level open world. But we also got a very strong indication that raid testing will be kicking off real soon. Moving over to the alpha test itself, and this week was the final phase of the original alpha roadmap, which has opened up the max level open world experience to testing, including new world events, the prey system, and the Argentina visitors. There is quite a lot there to dig through, so I'll be sharing my reactions and previews to that new content once I've had a chance to dig into it. But my initial first impression is that it is very similar to the War Within, but with a bit more variety in the world events. And I do suspect that it will very likely feel that there's a bit more to do at max level than was the case for the War Within's first season. The other main development for Midnight is something that I found unsurprising, but is nevertheless quite sad news. And that is the decision of the ElvUI developers to put their Midnight development on hold. The main reason that they gave for this decision was a similar decision that was made by the developers of Open Unit Frame, a library add-on that is used by many other add-on developers such as ElvUI to interface with many World of Warcraft user interface components. This honestly wasn't a major surprise to me. Unit frames, which if you're not familiar with the terminology, are basically the player and enemy health frames that you see on screen, including the ones for party and raid frames, are currently the most problematical part of the user interface for add-ons to apply even very basic cosmetic customizations. As the Open Unit Frame developers put it, currently add-ons cannot even achieve feature parity with the built-in version, let alone improve on it. Now, it is worth saying that putting development on hold is not the same thing as stopping it entirely, and I do suspect that the World of Warcraft developers will be paying very close attention to this development, with a view to making further improvements to ensure the add-ons are at the very least able to achieve Blizzard's promise of cosmetic customization and reskinning. But ElvUI is a massive add-on, and I've no doubt that it will require substantial work by its developers to get it release ready for Midnight. And that means that the clock is now very much ticking for Blizzard. As well as getting any necessary changes done in time for the release of the Midnight pre-patch, the WoW developers also need to make sure they allow enough time for add-on developers, many of whom do this in their spare time, to be able to make the changes that they need to their add-ons in order to get them ready in time as well. And for an add-on the size of ElvUI, that cut-off time is, I suspect, very soon. So just as with the WeCorners 2, I'm personally working on the basis that ElvUI probably will not be available at the release of Midnight. And I've been planning out an alternative Midnight user interface based around the default user interface, supplemented with a minimalist set of add-ons to bridge any functionality gaps, of which there are still many. The ironic result of this is that I will likely end up with even more add-ons in Midnight than I currently have. I have released a more in-depth video on the current state of the add-on restrictions and how they are likely to affect you, and I will add a link in the description below for you to catch up. I'm going to round up this week's news video with a couple of data mining discoveries. Do be aware that the first of these does contain some non-story related spoilers. And this is a possible hint where we might be going in patch 12.1. Ever since Dragonflight, it's become a bit of a tradition for hints of our next destination to turn up in the game for data mining, and this appears to be no different. Just off the coast of the new zone of Zulaman, there is an area of the map that looks very suspiciously like it could be an island, and one that is currently impossible to reach on the Midnight Alpha. This area was recently renamed to Atoll Utek, and is very likely based in Ulatek, a mysterious serpent goddess from the original Warcraft RPG game. And this week, Wowhead have found some icons for a possible Warlock tier set, which is labelled Raid Warlock Ulatek, which could very well be a hint that this is where the second main raid of the expansion is going to end up being. And finally, we have the discovery of the splash screen for the Midnight pre-patch, which contains a possible launch date for the pre-patch event of January the 27th. Now, this date marries up very well with that unnamed calendar event that was previously data mined as running from the 27th through to March the 9th, in which I speculated last week might be pointing towards the Midnight expansion release date. And this new discovery does, I think, add a lot more credence to that idea. But on top of that, there really would be no point putting a release date on the splash screen unless the pre-patch itself is going to be releasing beforehand, which strongly suggests to me that the pre-patch will be releasing sometime before the 27th. My own personal pick for the release of the pre-patch would be the previous week of January the 19th, which just happens to be the day after the already announced end date of Legion Remix. This would mean a 7-week long pre-patch, which will be the longest since Cataclysm. Most pre-patches are only around 4 to 5 weeks long, but with the scale of the user interface and add-on changes, it is quite believable that the developers might think that we would need a bit more time to adjust to the changes, and of course this would also serve to give add-on creators a bit more breathing space to catch up with any issues before the expansion proper releases. But that's all for this week. As always, I'm very interested in hearing all of your thoughts about any of these updates. Are you looking forward to the Brawlers Guild, or are you disappointed that we're only getting 4 new bosses? Let me know down below. If you found this update helpful, entertaining, and even just plain annoying, then let me know by hitting that like icon. And if you want to support my channel to grow and help me to make more of these videos along with my other content, then hit that subscribe button right now before you forget. If you don't want to miss out whenever I release a new video, then as well as subscribing, you can follow me in social media for updates. My links are in the description below as well.